Every elegant vault in this castle was paid for with the calluses on the hands of children. It was built to defy the industrial world. But the foundation of this defiance is the dirtiest money of the Industrial Revolution. Money earned from the 14-hour labor of young girls in cotton mills in 1912. Its creator was given absolute freedom, an inheritance from a family of industrialists. These people saw the world as a collection of resources. To them, rivers were just engines, and people were merely cogs. The priceless Babylonian tiles within these walls are dividends from stocks that grew on broken lives. And having received this power, he declared war, a war on the world that had enriched him. And this story is not just about architecture. Think about it. It's relevant even today, as we admire creations without questioning the origin of the money behind them. We will show you how this castle of protest was built and reveal who its creator was truly fighting, because he had an enemy more terrifying than the industrial age, an enemy that lived inside his own head. In Pennsylvania, there is a hill, and on it stands a building that does not belong. It rises from the mist like a medieval king's dream, abandoned in the heart of the American suburbs. Concrete towers, asymmetrical windows, chaotic roofs. This structure violates every law of symmetry and common sense. It looks as if it wasn't built, but grown, like some kind of geological phenomenon. Today, people line up to see it. Tour guides call it a national treasure, an architectural marvel. But in 1908, when the ugly wooden scaffolding first rose over the green fields of Doylestown, it had another name. The locals, watching this growing concrete madness, would shake their heads and smirk. They called it Mercer's Folly. In every stone of this building, in every drop of hardened mortar, is the will of one man, a man who despised his time. Henry Mercer, a Harvard graduate, a failed lawyer, an obsessed archaeologist and collector, decided to declare war on the industrial age. And his weapon was reinforced concrete. Old, faded photographs convey the bewilderment of that era. We see not a construction site as we understand it, but something more like an anthill, driven by an unknown force. The faces of the workers are the faces of farmers, hired for the winter, men whose hands were accustomed to the plow, not to rebar. They stare into the lens with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. What kind of madman was paying them to mix liquid stone and pour it into wooden boxes? This castle was not designed. It was willed into existence. There were no professional architects, no structural engineers. There was only Mercer, a tall, reclusive giant standing over 6'3", who molded models of future vaults from wet clay and sketched designs on scraps of paper. He saw this house in his head with an absolute, terrifying clarity. To his neighbors, it was the eccentric hobby of a wealthy recluse, a symbol of money with no better use. They didn't understand that what was unfolding before their eyes was not construction, but a philosophical act. Mercer wasn't just building a house. He was casting his defiance to an entire era in concrete. He took the most modern, most utilitarian, most ugly material of his time to create something eternal. A fortress against the fire he so pathologically feared, and a fortress against time, which he felt was mercilessly erasing the traces of true craftsmanship and manual labor. This concrete was paid for not just with money, but with an absolute, almost tyrannical confidence in his own righteousness. A confidence that allowed him to ignore the laws of physics, the ridicule of the press, and common sense. He forced this castle into being, bending both matter and men to his will. He built his fortress and silenced everyone. But he failed to consider that the main question future generations would ask is not how he did it, but at what cost. Because to build a monument to his contempt for the industrial world, he needed money. A lot of money. And it came from the very heart of the industrial machine he so hated. We tend to think of this castle as a work of art, an artist's rebellion. But that is a misconception. Before it became concrete, Mercer's vision was money. And money, like people, has a past. The past of this money smells not of clay and art, but of machine oil, sweat, and coal soot. Every column in Fonthill casts a shadow. But it is a shadow cast not by the sun, but by the giant smokestacks of 19th century industrial Massachusetts. The source of Mercer's wealth was not his famous tiles. His tile-making was more of a passion, a successful but self-sustaining project. The foundation of the castle was laid long before his birth, in the capital inherited from his aunt, Elizabeth Lawrence. The name of this family, Lawrence, was carved into the face of all of New England. Her father-in-law, Abbot Lawrence, was not just an industrialist. He was one of the architects of the new American aristocracy, a co-founder of the cartel known as the Boston Associates. These men saw the world not as a community, but as a set of resources. To them, the Merrimack River wasn't nature. It was the drive belt of a giant money-making machine. And people were just another cog. Their cotton mills were monsters of brick and iron, devouring raw materials from the south and human lives from the north. Archival photographs show us the faces of those who paid for Mercer's future. Young girls, almost children, standing at their looms for 12, 14 hours a day. Their lungs were filled with cotton dust. Their fingers were mangled by spindles that moved as fast as bullets. This elegant vault in Fonthill's drawing room was paid for with the calluses on their hands. The city named after the family, Lawrence, Massachusetts, became a symbol of this exploitation. And it was there, in 1912, as Mercer was pouring the final floors of his castle, that patience ran out. Tens of thousands of workers, mostly women and immigrants, took to the streets. This strike went down in history as the Bread and Roses strike. They weren't just demanding a raise. They were demanding the right to human dignity. In response, they got police batons and the bayonets of the National Guard. This collection of priceless Babylonian tiles that Mercer embedded in the walls, these are the dividends from stocks whose value grew on broken lives. Railroads, banks, factories. The Lawrence family capital was the lifeblood of the new industrial America. Blood that flowed through generations and cleansed by time and legal documents ended up in the bank account of a beloved nephew, Henry. He received an inheritance that gave him absolute freedom. The freedom to create, the freedom to build, the freedom to despise the very industrial world that had made him fabulously wealthy. This is the central, most profound paradox of Fonthill. This castle is a monument to manual labor, erected with money earned from its destruction. It is an anti-industrial utopia built on the dirtiest profits of the Industrial Revolution. Now, having received this power, this freedom, what would he do with it? He would declare a war on the world that enriched him, and a war against his primary, internal demon. Freedom is the heaviest of burdens. Having received a fortune that could buy him any palace in Europe, any luxury available to man at the dawn of the 20th century, Henry Mercer made a choice no one could understand. He didn't buy comfort. He bought a war. First, it was a war against the world around him. The world of assembly lines, steam engines, and faceless goods that he despised with all his soul. In his diaries and letters, we see a man who feels like a stranger in his own era. He called himself a collector of junk, but by junk, he meant everything his contemporaries were throwing onto the scrap heap of history. Old tools, pots, locks, objects that still held the warmth of human hands. He saw industrialization erasing this memory, and the thought was unbearable to him. But there was another war, a much deeper and more personal one, a war with an inner demon. An inextinguishable fire smoldered in his mind. Pyrophobia, a panicked, irrational fear of fire, was not just a quirk, it was the axis around which his entire world revolved. To him, fire was the physical embodiment of oblivion. He saw flames devour old estates, turning libraries, collections, and entire generations of stories into ash. His own collection, his treasures saved from oblivion, was made of wood, paper, and fabric. It was vulnerable, and that vulnerability drove him mad. And so, these two currents, contempt for modernity and terror of fire, merged into one grandiose, insane plan. Fonthill. This is not a house. It is a manifesto, cast in liquid stone. Mercer decided to build something that, by its very nature, could not burn. And to do so, he chose the material he most despised, reinforced concrete, the ugly child of industry, the material of factories, bridges, and bunkers. He takes his enemy's weapon and turns it back on him. He will prove that from this cold, gray dust, something living, eternal, and beautiful can be created. He will build a fireproof time capsule. He wasn't building himself a refuge. He was building an argument against the aesthetics of his time, which demanded elegance and symmetry. His castle would be asymmetrical, rough, honest. An argument against the laws of engineering, which required calculations and blueprints. His will would be his only blueprint. Every wall of this building was meant to scream into the face of the machine age. I exist in spite of you. Every concrete vault was a declaration. You cannot burn me. Mercer saw the world as an arena where the strongest survive, and his home was a monument to this philosophy. He didn't just want to preserve the past. He wanted to lock it in a safe that neither fire nor time could crack. He had found his material. He had found his idea. Now he needed hands, but he didn't trust the hands of his time. To build a monument to manual labor, he would reject all professionals and turn to those who still remembered what the earth felt like. To build the castle of the future, a fortress of indestructible concrete capable of surviving a millennium. Who would you hire? The country's best engineers, the most experienced contractors, crews who knew all the secrets of the new material. Henry Mercer hired none of them. He rejected them all. He saw in their professionalism the virus of the very modernity he was fleeing. Their calculations, their blueprints, their standards. To him, this was all the language of the enemy. He turned to the land, to men whose hands were calloused from the plow, not the trowel, whose calendars were marked by the seasons of sowing and reaping, not by project deadlines. His army consisted of a handful of local farmers and laborers, 10, maybe 12 men who knew how to build wooden barns and stone fences, but they had never seen liquid stone flow into wooden forms to become a wall. To them, it was magic, the black magic of the 20th century. And how did this general command his army? Without maps, without orders, without blueprints. There was not a single engineering plan on the entire gigantic construction site. Mercer was a walking blueprint. He would wander among the wooden forms, tall, silent, and point with his finger. He scratched sketches on scraps of wood, and when words and drawings weren't enough, he would get down on his knees, take wet clay in his hands, and like a demiurge god, sculpt miniature models of the future vaults and arches. "Here," he would say, "build it like this." It was a strange dialogue between genius and muscle. He spoke the language of Gothic cathedrals and Byzantine domes. They understood the language of weight, leverage, and exhaustion. They saw before them only a chaotic web of planks and wire, while he saw in it the future ceiling of his library. Their technology was a match for their experience. All the mechanical power of the construction site, all its technical progress, was contained in the muscles and sinews of a single horse. Her name was Lucy. Day after day, week after week, she walked in a circle, turning a primitive winch that lifted buckets of concrete to the top. Each bucket, a drop in an ocean of concrete. Each bucket, another heartbeat in the body of the nascent monster. This castle was not built by machines. It was built by the patience of one horse and the sweat of a dozen men. They built without fully understanding what they were building. They believed not in blueprints, but in the man who paid their wages. It was a faith mixed with bewilderment, a faith that this insane structure of wet concrete and wood would not one day collapse on their heads. Mercer asked them not just to build. He asked them to believe in his obsession. He built his castle on intuition, scorning calculations. He believed his will could bend the material to his command. But there are laws more ancient than any will. Laws written not on paper, but in the very heart of the universe. And one of these laws, gravity, was simply waiting for its moment to deliver its verdict. The intuition of a genius is a powerful force. It can raise empires and create masterpieces. But intuition has an enemy, ruthless and impartial: physics. And one day, it struck back. Picture the day. The air is thick with the moisture of fresh concrete. It smells of wet wooden forms and sweat. The workers, already accustomed to their employer's eccentricities, are pouring another complex vault. They trust Mercer's clay model. They trust his confident gaze. They do as they are told. And then, suddenly, first, a quiet crack, the alarming sound of splintering wood, which on a construction site means one thing: disaster. And then, a deafening, monstrous crash. Several tons of wet, still unsettled concrete, along with rebar and wooden supports, come crashing down. A cloud of cement dust explodes into the air, obscuring the sun. Silence falls, a heavy, ringing silence of panic. Fortunately, no one was killed. But something else was broken that day. Faith. For the workers, it was a sign, a sentence. They were building a Tower of Babel, and now the heavens had punished them for their hubris. A whisper spread throughout Doylestown. Mercer's folly is collapsing. Everyone expected him to stop now. Any sane person would have admitted defeat, hired engineers, reevaluated the entire project. But Henry Mercer was not a sane person. He was a man possessed. To him, that crash sounded not like a funeral march, but a challenge. Gravity had shown him its power, and he accepted the fight. His response was not in calculations or elegant engineering solutions. His response was simple, brutal, and entirely in his character. If the structure collapsed, it meant it wasn't massive enough. If a wall proved weak, it needed to be made twice as thick. He didn't try to negotiate with gravity, to find a compromise. He decided to crush it with sheer weight, volume, mass. He ordered the workers to clear the rubble and start again. But this time, the vaults would be thicker. The columns, more massive. The walls at the base would be 5 feet thick. He turned his castle into a battleship, capable of withstanding any blow, even from nature itself. This decision was pure Mercer. He saw the world not as a system of laws to be understood, but as chaos to be subdued. This collapse didn't teach him caution, It only fortified his stubbornness. He wasn't looking for elegance. He was looking for invincibility. Every subsequent ton of concrete, lifted to the top by the horse named Lucy, was his answer to the universe. "You can try to break my creation," he seemed to say, "but I will make it so heavy, so monolithic, that you simply won't have the strength." He won that round. The castle stood, but new clouds were already gathering on the horizon. The enemy was approaching from another direction, not from below, but from above. Its name was Winter. There are enemies you can defeat with force, and there are those with whom you can only negotiate. The nature of Pennsylvania is one of them. When the first frosts grip the land, construction stops. This is an axiom, especially construction with concrete. Water, freezing inside the still unsettled mixture, turns to ice, shattering it from within. Frost is a death sentence for any concrete structure. Any contractor, any engineer, any worker knows you don't pour concrete in winter. Construction is put on hold until spring. But Henry Mercer did not recognize axioms. His will knew no seasonal breaks. To stop for several months, to let the elements dictate his schedule, that was tantamount to surrender. And so he gives an order that finally convinces everyone of his madness. He orders them to continue. Before the astonished eyes of the town, another structure begins to grow over the unfinished concrete skeleton of the castle, a ghostly, temporary one. The entire construction site, all its towering walls and turrets, is covered with a gigantic tent of oiled canvas. Dozens of sheets are sewn together, stretched over a wooden frame. Fonthill was transformed into a giant greenhouse, an ugly cocoon, inside of which a miracle was supposed to happen. And for this miracle to occur, an artificial summer had to be created inside that cocoon. All around the perimeter, beneath the walls, workers set up dozens of kerosene heaters. Simple, smoking potbelly stoves that filled the enclosed space with acrid smoke, soot, and most importantly, warmth. The scene must have been hellish. Imagine these men working inside a giant tent saturated with kerosene. In the semi-darkness, amidst a labyrinth of wooden supports, they mix concrete, carry buckets, battling not only exhaustion, but also suffocation. The air is thick and heavy. The flickering flames of the heaters dance on the wet concrete walls, creating the illusion of a cave inhabited by shadows. And here, the irony reaches its peak. The man whose life was governed by a panic-stricken fear of fire, the man who was building an indestructible fortress from non-combustible material, now surrounded his creation with dozens of open flames. He risked starting a colossal fire that could have destroyed not only the wooden forms and the canvas, but his entire crew. He was ready to burn everything to the ground just to prove his castle was fireproof. This was a battle not with the elements, but with the very idea of compromise. Mercer could not wait. His vision demanded continuous embodiment. Every day of delay was a personal insult to him. And so he created this artificial, suffocating, mortally dangerous climate to deceive the winter. He forced his men to work in conditions more like the underworld than a construction site. But while they waged this crude, brutal war against the cold, pouring tons of gray concrete, a different kind of work was happening in parallel. Delicate, elegant, requiring not strength, but incredible precision. Mercer was about to fuse a soul into the flesh of his monster. In the heart of this concrete chaos, amidst the roar and soot, a sacred ritual was taking place. While the rough hands of workers poured liquid stone into forms, other hands, under Mercer's personal maniacal control, were doing something unthinkable. They were taking history, fragile, priceless, fired in the kilns of Babylon, Persia, medieval Spain, and plunging it into the raw, aggressive mass of concrete. It was the strangest union imaginable. On one side, a brutal, modern material, a symbol of industrial might. On the other, thousands of ceramic tiles, artifacts that had survived centuries and empires. Mercer wasn't just decorating the walls with them, he was immuring them. He was making history part of the load-bearing structure. Imagine the tension. A worker who had just been hauling buckets of heavy mortar had to take a tile several thousand years old in his calloused fingers and carefully, at the right angle, press it into the still wet surface. One wrong move, and the priceless artifact would be shattered. Press too hard, and it would sink into the gray mass forever. Too lightly, and it would fall out after setting. Stories have survived of Mercer's fury when a tile was set crooked by even a millimeter. He would force them to break entire sections and start all over. This was not decoration. It was an operation to transplant a soul. He was turning his castle into a gigantic treasure box, where the treasures were not only the objects inside, but the walls themselves. The apotheosis of this madness was the Columbus Room. Here, on the ceiling, Mercer decided to lay out an entire narrative with tiles of his own making, the story of the discovery of America. Each tile is a scene: Columbus's ships, his meeting with the natives, symbols of the old and new worlds. It is literally history hanging over your head. To create it, the workers first laid out the mosaic on the floor, and then, flipping the formwork over, poured concrete on top of it. It was the work of a jeweler on an industrial scale, performed by the hands of farmers. Over 20,000 tiles found their final resting place within these walls. Each one was paid for not just with money, but with risk, tension, and an almost religious awe. Mercer wasn't just building. He was writing a book where the pages were walls, and the ink was fired clay. He didn't trust museums. He didn't trust collectors. He believed only in the monolith. He was sealing the past in concrete, creating an alloy that, he believed, neither time nor fire nor human ignorance could destroy. But for this alloy to be truly strong, it needed an internal structure. It needed reinforcement. And what Mercer chose as the steel skeleton for his castle became the final proof of his philosophy. He decided to reinforce the future with the trash of the past. Any reinforced concrete building is a union of two forces. Concrete resists compression, and steel resists tension. Together, they create an almost indestructible structure. In the early 20th century, engineers were already using standard steel rods, I-beams, factory products, standardized and predictable. But for Henry Mercer, the word standard was a curse. He couldn't just buy rebar. That would be too simple, too modern. He found a solution that was both brilliant in its economy and deeply symbolic in its essence. He began to buy up scrap metal. Not just any scrap metal, but a very specific kind. Throughout the county, across farms and villages, he sent out a call. He was buying old, broken, rusty tools, everything that the industrial age was casting onto the scrap heap, and the streams of a vanishing world began to flow to him. Broken plows that had once tilled this land, bent harrows whose teeth had pulled up more than one weed, torn chains, old traps, worn-out horseshoes, discarded kitchen stoves. All this metal junk, these ghosts of pre-industrial America, were brought to the Fonthill construction site. And here, Mercer performed an act that could be called archaeology in reverse. An archaeologist excavates the past to bring it to light. Mercer, however, took this past and buried it alive, in the very heart of his creation. These rusty, crooked, work-weary pieces of metal became the reinforcement for his castle. Workers laid them in wooden forms and poured concrete over them. A plow that would never again touch the earth found new life, becoming the hidden skeleton of a wall. A chain that had held a cow now held the weight of a ceiling vault. Every stone in this wall is not just concrete. It is a mausoleum for forgotten things. It is an act of salvation through burial. Mercer gave this trash a new structural function. He turned it into the secret strength of his castle. He wasn't just building with concrete. He was building with memory. For him, this was the highest form of justice. Objects created by manual labor, which had become useless in the age of machines, now served as the support for a building that was his personal protest against that age. He was fusing the DNA of the old world into the body of the new. This building is literally filled with ghosts. Entombed in its walls are thousands of stories of labor, of failure, of the daily lives of people whose names have been erased from memory. And this hidden, chaotic, unpredictable rebar made of scrap metal perfectly reflected the very essence of the project, rough, intuitive, created not by rules, but by the command of will. The walls grew, hiding their secrets, and as they rose, it became clear that Mercer was not just building a house, he was building a physical embodiment of his mind. As the concrete walls rose above the ground, they began to form into something strange, something that refused to obey the logic of a residential home. Right angles disappeared. Corridors ceased to be mere paths from one point to another. They began to twist, to branch, to lead to dead ends. Stairs appeared in the most unexpected places, leading to tiny mezzanines or abruptly ending at a wall. The castle has 44 rooms, but finding a direct path between any two of them is almost impossible. This is not architecture. It is the topography of a mind. Fonthill is not a house in which a person lives. It is a physical model of one man's mind, in which you can get lost. Every turn, every level is not a functional solution, but an associative link in Mercer's own brain. This small room is needed to display a collection of Dutch tiles. A narrow staircase leads up from it, because he decided that his engravings on the same theme should be nearby. And from there, a dark passage to another part of the building, because it reminds him of the alleyways of medieval Toledo. The building was not designed for convenience. It was designed for storage. Storage for objects and storage for ideas. Rooms flow into one another, not by the laws of ergonomics, but by the laws of cataloging. It is a gigantic, three-dimensional catalog of his collections, his thoughts, his obsessions. A journey through this castle is not a walk through a house. It is a wandering through the labyrinth of another's memory. There is no center, no grand hall or main entrance in the traditional sense. The building seems to deny the hierarchy of space. It pulsates, growing in different directions, like a living organism. It declares that the logic here is different, internal. This convoluted layout was another one of Mercer's weapons, a weapon against predictability, against symmetry, against everything he hated in modern architecture. He created a space that forces you to think like him. To find your way, you must abandon conventional notions of a house and try to understand the logic of a collector. This house is his brain, cast in concrete, with its bright, sunlit halls, his brilliant insights, with its tangled corridors, his complex, contradictory thoughts. And like any mind, it had its dark, hidden corners, places he peered into himself and forced his rare guests to peer into. And in the very heart of this labyrinth, he built a room dedicated to his greatest fear. But this was not the fear of fire. It was the fear of sin. Deep within the concrete labyrinth, Far from any windows letting in the sunlight, there is a place where the castle ceases to be merely an eccentric home and becomes something more unsettling. It is a small, almost claustrophobic space known as the Fear Room. There are no elegant Persian patterns or bright Dutch landscapes here. The walls of this room are lined with tiles of a completely different kind. These are grim, almost monochromatic images based on medieval engravings, and each one is an illustration of punishment for the 7 deadly sins. Here is a tile depicting pride, a man being thrown from a breaking wheel. Here, gluttony, a poor soul is forced to eat toads and snakes. Lust, sinners languish in fire and brimstone. Each image is a small theater of cruelty, frozen in clay and glaze. What is this? Why would a scholar, an archaeologist, an aesthete need to create this personal, man-made hell in the center of his home? This wasn't just a collection. Mercer designed these tiles himself, meticulously studying the iconography of medieval manuscripts. He didn't find them. He created them. It was his conscious choice. Perhaps it was the dark joke of an intellectual, a warning to guests not to overstay their welcome. Remember, the walls seem to say, that pleasure is followed by retribution. Or perhaps, was it a reflection of his own fears? Mercer, a man who avoided close relationships his entire life, who lived almost like a monk in his castle, perhaps saw in these sins a threat to his seclusion, to the purity of his vision. Pride. Was his castle not its ultimate manifestation? Envy, wrath, greed. Were they not the fuel for the industrial machine whose money he used? This room could have been his personal confessional, a place where he came face to face with the demons he saw in the world around him, and perhaps within himself. Or maybe it's all simpler and more terrifying. In creating his ideal world, his Eden of concrete, Mercer, like a true creator, could not help but also create a place for exile. He built a paradise where he felt safe, but he was smart enough to understand that no walls can protect you from the darkness that lives inside a person. The Fear Room is a reminder that even in the most impregnable fortress, the main enemy is always within. He created a space filled with objects and ideas. He filled it to the brim. But it soon became clear that he had left another, unforeseen, resonant space in his creation, a void that could not be filled with anything. The castle was nearly complete. Its concrete skin had hardened, turning into an indestructible armor. It was protected from fire. It was protected from time. But a fundamental, unforeseen flaw emerged, something that Mercer, in his obsession with the material, had completely overlooked. Sound. There was no wood in the castle, no carpets, draperies, or soft furniture. Nothing that could absorb sound, only bare, hard, unforgiving concrete. The walls, floors, vaulted ceilings, all of it worked like a giant resonator. And in this stony silence, a monster was born, the echo. Any sound that escaped the lips did not fade. It would hit a wall, bounce to the ceiling, ricochet off the floor, and set off on an endless journey through the labyrinth of corridors. A normal conversation turned into an unintelligible din. Footsteps echoed like booming blows, haunting the one who walked. A whisper in one room could be heard as a faint, unsettling murmur in another. Mercer had built the perfect acoustic trap. This castle, created to store thousands of stories, turned out to be a place where it was impossible to tell a single one. To speak with someone in the same room, you had to either shout over the din or get right up close and speak almost directly into their ear. The space that was meant to unite his collections divided people. It was the ultimate irony of his creation. In his pursuit of an eternal material, he had created a living environment that was utterly uncomfortable. He built a fortress that protected from external threats, but inside, it turned any human communication into torture. This house was not conducive to conversation, to laughter, to arguments. It was conducive to silence. And in this silence, the loneliness that was already Mercer's companion took on a physical form. It became tangible. It was in that din, in that echo, which reminded you that any sound you made would return to you, distorted and amplified. The castle became the ideal environment for a hermit. It didn't just allow one to be alone, it forced one to be alone. The walls that were supposed to protect his treasures became the walls of his personal prison, a prison where the only intelligible voice was the one in his own head. He had conquered fire. He had conquered gravity. He had conquered winter. But he lost the battle with the void. But for the outside world, none of this mattered. In 1912, the scaffolding came down, and the residents of Doylestown and all of America saw for the first time what had been hidden beneath the canvas cocoon. The laughter died down. It was time for astonishment. 1912. 4 years of ridicule, rumors, and bewildered glances had come to an end. The wooden scaffolding, like dry, dead skin, fell away from the concrete giant. The canvas tent was dismantled, and there it was, Mercer's folly, revealed to the world, and the world fell silent. It's one thing to laugh at a strange rich man building something on a hill. It's quite another to stand before it, before the undeniable, intimidating, and mesmerizing fact of it. It was unlike anything else. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but it was powerful. It had weight, not just physical weight, but the weight of an idea taken to its absolute limit. What had seemed like madness in the making now looked like a prophecy. The chaotic jumble of towers and walls had resolved into a single, organic silhouette. The rough, unfinished concrete, bearing the imprints of its wooden forms, no longer looked like a mistake and was now seen as a bold aesthetic statement. The building was no longer a folly. It had become the castle. The same newspapers that had mocked the project just yesterday were now scrambling to send reporters and photographers. Articles were peppered with new words: unique, revolutionary, a masterpiece. The architects Mercer despised now came to Doylestown to study his methods. They walked around this concrete monolith, clicking their tongues, trying to understand how it could possibly stand, built without a single blueprint by a handful of local farmers. He had won, without a single public speech, without a press release, without an explanation. His argument was the castle itself. He simply presented it to the world, and the world was forced to accept its reality. He didn't ask for recognition. He demanded it, casting his demands in thousands of tons of concrete. And while everyone was discussing his creation, he made his final, most important symbolic gesture. He simply gathered his belongings and moved in. He didn't hold a grand opening. He didn't cut a ribbon. He just walked into his castle, closed the heavy door behind him, and began to live in it. In the unfinished, echoing, cold space, it was a coronation. He didn't wait for someone to place him on a throne. He built his own throne, built his own kingdom, and proclaimed himself its king. The king in his concrete kingdom. The man who hated his own century made that century talk about him. The hermit who fled from society found himself at the center of everyone's attention. He built a fortress to hide. But in the end, that fortress made him more visible than ever. Now he faced the most difficult part, living in the world he had created for himself. The king had ascended the throne. But what was happening behind the walls of this kingdom? The imagination conjures up lavish balls, society receptions, eccentric parties. After all, why else would you build a castle with 44 rooms? The reality was diametrically opposed. Fonthill was never a palace. It became a monastery. No balls, no receptions. Mercer lived in his gigantic creation like an ascetic. His throne room was the library, his ballroom, the workshop, his private quarters, a tiny, almost monastic cell with a simple bed and a writing desk. The man who built himself 44 rooms essentially lived in just one of them. His chief companions were not people, they were things, the thousands of objects in his collection, which had now found their eternal home, and his beloved fox terrier, Rollo, the dog, for whom a separate room was set aside in the castle, and to whom, after its death, Mercer would dedicate a memorial tile with a touching epitaph. His only permanent neighbors were his housekeeper, Laura Swain, and her husband, who occupied a separate, isolated wing. Guests did visit the castle, but they were not socialites or wealthy neighbors. They were scholars, artists, historians, figures from the arts and crafts movement, people who spoke the same language as him. They came not for dinner, but for conversation. They would wander through the echoing corridors, discussing not society gossip, but rare manuscripts and medieval ceramic techniques. The castle was not a place for living, but a place for working, a giant laboratory of thought. Mercer didn't enjoy his creation. He serviced it. He continued to catalog, to write, to work on the design of new tiles. Often at night, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, he would roam his concrete labyrinth like a ghost, inspecting his domain. This house, built with such ferocity and passion, turned out to be cold and inhospitable. The concrete walls leached the warmth, and the monstrous acoustics killed conversation. But perhaps this was exactly what Mercer had been aiming for. He didn't build a home for living, but an ideal environment for preservation, for the preservation of objects, and for the preservation of his own solitude. He didn't live in the castle. He lived inside his legacy. Every day, he woke up in his own future museum. He was its first and only visitor. It was not a home, but a mausoleum in which he had decided to live while still alive. He had achieved everything he wanted. He had built eternity. But now he had to figure out how to make this eternity truly eternal, how to maintain control over his creation even after his own time had run out. For most people, the final act is death. For Henry Mercer, death was just a tool for establishing final, eternal control. In 1930, in his concrete castle, he dies of kidney disease. But he was ready. He had spent years creating his ultimate masterpiece, and it wasn't the castle. It was his will, a 23-page document, dry, legal, devoid of emotion. But at its core, it was the most powerful act of creation in his life. This was not just a distribution of property. It was a legal time machine designed to ensure his will would outlive his body and operate forever. In this text, Mercer prescribes the future of his castle with maniacal meticulousness. Fonthill was to become not a home, not private property, but a museum of ceramics and tile. It would be open for the education and enjoyment of the public. But then comes the main, most important clause, the strike of a gavel that seals his design forever. He categorically forbids any changes, any at all. Nothing could be rebuilt. The exhibition could not be changed. The furniture could not be moved. Not even new paintings could be hung. He freezes his home in time, turning it from a living organism into an inviolable artifact. This was the apotheosis of his power. He understood that physically, he was not eternal, but his will clad in the armor of law, could become immortal. He used the legal system he once despised to protect his creation from the future, from changing tastes, from new owners, from the very idea of progress. The will became the last, thickest wall with which he surrounded his castle, a wall of paragraphs and articles that could be destroyed by neither sledgehammer nor time. His physical life had ended, but his power over Fonthill became absolute. He died, but he never left. His gaze still watches every visitor from unseen portraits. His rules still govern every inch of this space. He didn't just build a castle, he became its eternal, invisible guardian. He turned his own death into a guarantee of immortality for his creation. And this final act of control poses the ultimate question: what did he really leave us? And so, here we are again, on the same hill. More than 100 years have passed. The world has changed beyond recognition. Empires have fallen. Technology has transformed the planet. And Fonthill Castle stands, unchanged, indestructible, exactly as its creator left it. Why did it survive? The answer is twofold, like the very nature of this place. On one hand, there is the raw, honest material. Concrete doesn't rot, doesn't burn, and is almost impervious to time. Mercer bet on the most durable material of his era, and the bet paid off. But there is another, more important reason. Fonthill survived thanks to an iron will, cemented not in its walls, but in those 23 pages of his will. His power, legally flawless, outlived him by decades, protecting the castle from any encroachment. He created not just a building, but a self-sustaining system, governed by a ghost. And today, wandering through these echoing corridors, we encounter the central paradox, frozen in liquid stone. A man who fled the industrial age built one of the most avant-garde, modernist buildings of his time. He did it with dirty industrial money, earned from the exploitation of thousands of workers. He sold the idea of handicraft and medieval authenticity to the very elite that had destroyed that same handicraft with mass production. So, what is Fonthill? A monument to a genius? Or a monument to his contradictions? A triumph of will over matter? Or a story of great loneliness cast in concrete? It offers no simple answers. It asks questions about the price of progress, about the nature of creativity, about whether beauty born from injustice can ever be truly beautiful. Fonthill is not just a building. It is the eternal argument its creator had with the world and with himself. An argument about how one man's ambitions, fears, and obsessions can cheat time itself, leaving behind something more than just a house, something that resembles eternity. In the end, Fonthill Castle is not just a building. It is an argument frozen in concrete, a genius's argument with his era, an artist's argument with the source of his wealth. It is a monument to a will that managed to subdue matter, but ultimately trapped its creator in an echoing labyrinth of solitude. And looking at these walls today, we are left with the main question: can we, and should we, separate the creation from its cost? What does our admiration for this concrete marvel say about us, about our willingness to forgive its origins in the name of genius? This argument, started by Henry Mercer over a century ago, continues right now, in your thoughts. Share them in the comments, because it is in such a dialogue that truth is born. Your support, a like and a subscription, will allow us to continue telling stories that make you see the world differently.